my brood. Sometimes we're faced with questions about masking and why we do it, what led us to it, why we are so exhausted after masking for so long. And I think that sometimes this is where an analogy can step in and really help convey the experience that we've had. And so today I offer up an analogy in the style of Lord of the Rings. In our scenario, we're going to talk about a group of elves marching through a snowy forest, and joining them is a dwarf. As you might know if you've read the books or seen the movies, the elves are moving easily across this snowy forest. They're walking on top of the snow. It's not really a big deal to them. But our dwarf is walking through the snow. They're much shorter than the elves, and they don't have this ability to just walk on top of the snow. But nevertheless, the dwarves are tough, and our dwarf is walking along in they're maybe chest height in the snow, and they're pushing through, and it's quite tiring and it's slowing them down. And even though they are not too exhausted at this point, they're still pushing forward. They can't help but be constantly pointed out by the elves that their behavior is odd. The elves are looking at the dwarf and saying, "What are you doing? Why are you making this so hard for yourself? Just walk on top of the snow." And meanwhile, the dwarf can clearly see that the elves are walking on top of the snow. The dwarf can clearly see that it's possible, yet when they raise their foot and put their foot on top of the snow, they just sink back through and they doubt themselves. And so they say, "Well, I'm trying, but I don't understand how." And the elves laugh and maybe call them silly, ridiculous, incapable. But nevertheless, they say, "Just, it's not hard. Just do it. Just walk on top of the snow." And the dwarf doesn't really understand. So even though they've tried, they end up moving a little bit to the outside of the group, maybe off to the side, maybe a little bit behind, maybe between two groups of elves, but nevertheless, they separate themselves a little bit, just enough to stay involved, but far enough away that they're not constantly getting ridiculed for walking through the snow. Now, eventually, the group, the elves and the dwarf, they come upon an enemy battle and they begin battle. The dwarf, however, is exhausted by this point. They've been pushing through the snow, chest height, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. It's hard work, but they join the battle nonetheless. And even though they're a very capable, very prominent fighter, they underperform because they're just so tired. And even though they did their part, they're still ridiculed. The elves see that this dwarf just didn't stand up to what they said they could do. Now, here in our perspective, well, we know that the elves can walk on the snow, and we know that the dwarves can't. But to them, one of these things, walking on the snow, is an innate ability, and the other one doesn't have it. But you can imagine if the two sides aren't aware of their differences, then not walking on the snow seems ridiculous. Walking through the snow seems like an unnecessary difficulty that anyone should be able to do. But of course, this is only really the case because it's a group of elves with one dwarf. I think what's interesting is if we reverse the situation and we have a group of dwarves in the mines, perhaps, and one elf joining them. In this case, I think that the elves are out of their element, where they were walking on top of the snow before. Now they're having to duck down and they're having to traverse through the darkness and sometimes with very low ceilings. And the dwarves are just thriving. The dwarves are moving through the spaces with no problems. They're in an environment that suits them. But it's obvious in this case. The dwarves can clearly see that the ceilings are too low for the elves. The elves can clearly state, well, this isn't for me. This environment isn't one that I'm capable of doing my best in. I'm limited by the mobility. I think that it goes well to show that in real life, that society is built up in a way that does work for most people. But then in environments where neurodivergence thrive, maybe at home, maybe in nature, maybe in technology, whatever your particular space of thriving is, it would be easy for a majority of neurotypicals to say, well, I can't thrive in this space. How can anyone thrive in this space? You need to just get out. You need to go socialize. You need to go join a club. You need to go do this and that and the other thing because this isn't the way that real life is. It's unfortunate, I think, that we have these difficult back and forths where instead of appreciating how one group of people can thrive in one space and another group of people can thrive in a different space, it gets challenged. And oftentimes the larger group wins to say, well, we have to create society in this way. And I understand that we do need to try and make things as accommodated as possible, and that applies to the masses. But throughout all of this, why don't we try to accommodate things? Coming back to our analogy, maybe the dwarf out there in the snowy forest marching towards battle, maybe that's exactly where that dwarf wants to be. They just need two things. They need the elves to understand that the way that things work for this dwarf is a little bit different, and that's okay. And they also need an accommodation. Now, I don't know if skis exist in Middle Earth, and perhaps the image of a dwarf skiing along through the snowy forest is a little humorous, but maybe there are accommodations that can be made. Skis or a horse or some other creature to help them through the snow.